Welcome, everyone, to Creating a Family, talk about infertility, adoption, and foster care. I'm Dawn Davenport. I am the host of this show as well as the director of creatingafamily.org. Today, we're going to be talking about making peace with living child-free. We will be talking with Rebecca and Sally Ann Majoya. They live in central Vermont and collectively have experience working in education, writing, wellness, and social work. But the reason they're here with us today is that they are the co-authors of a joint memoir titled Uncertain Fruit. We also have Carol Lieber-Wilkins. She is a licensed marriage and family therapist in private practice. She is licensed in California, Idaho, and Nevada, and she provides individual and couples counseling as well as psychoeducational consultations for those moving into alternative paths of parenthood. So welcome, Rebecca, Sally Ann, and Carol to Creating a Family. This is a topic I don't think we do enough. We do a disservice by not talking about enough. So thank you. I am thankful that we are talking about it, and I'm thankful to have all of you here to talk about it.
Thank you.
Rebecca and Sally Ann, I want you two can decide how to split up the talking, but I'd like to start with your story of infertility treatment, and adoption, so that to put a face on the having to make the decision of deciding to live child-free.
Great. So, we started the journey to have a baby and to broaden our family in about 2004. And it was I had been diagnosed with PCOS. And it was a long process of treatments and insemination processes as well, which took about 8 years.
8 years. And there was a lot of naturopathic as well.
Yes.
Sally Ann tried both modern medicine ways to deal with the infertility as well as...
Primarily using IUI, intrauterine insemination.
Primarily,
yeah.
yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay.
And we got to a point where we decided that this wasn't working in the way that we had hoped. And we were considering, first we considered foster care, actually. It's still hoping to have an infant. So we were hoping that we could adopt through foster care. Unfortunately, though, we were a little wary of that even after we went through the training, because we know, we have known people, first of all, who have had infants. And since the goal in foster care is reunification, many times they ended up having an infant and then had to give the infant up, or the young child up, after having them for a couple of years.
Yeah, a long time.
Yes.
We had friends who had a baby for more than 18 months.
Right.
And from like 5 weeks. They got the baby at like 5 weeks, or one at 5 days. Mm-hmm. So and a couple times they went through this to give the baby back, which just seemed so difficult. Yes. We respected the process of foster care and that is the goal, but of course it wasn't our.
But it doesn't make it for you. It just
exactly.
No.
We encourage people to make the best decision for them. There is no moral high ground here that says that you need to subject yourself just because you are struggling with infertility, right?
Correct. Yes. So then we explored private adoption from there. And actually, as the book details, we ended up having a situation where somebody that we knew a young woman who was considering an adoption. Mm-hmm. And in a short period of time, we were thrust into a private adoption, and it didn't go the way that we had hoped. And we lost the infant after 10 days.
And we actually saw that baby born. Mm-hmm. She was so determined, this young woman, that she was going to give up the baby, that she wanted us in the room. She wanted us to see the baby born. She wanted it immediately the baby taken out of the room. She, in the hospital, let us make all the decisions about name, circumcision, like any decisions, even though she had legal custody. We had physical custody initially. But then after we had the baby home for almost a week, so we had the baby for 10 days, she changed her mind.
Yes, and there were other extenuating factors in that circumstance, and a lot of what we would later consider red flags. But we learned a lot through that.
The hard way.
The hard way. Yes.
And then at that point, you started considering seriously the option of stopping your quest to have or adopt a baby.
Yes, yes. We did actually try again with an adoption agency, but we did end up deciding that we didn't want to go through the process. We were a little dismayed with the agency process that we were working with. And that at that point was really when we ended our process, I guess you could call it.
Right. Okay. So we're going to come back to that process of decision making. But now I want to, it's an interesting thing. Research has found, true, we all know anecdotally that deciding to live child-free is becoming increasingly common in the U.S. And there's actually been some research on it that found that 30% of women of childbearing age identify as wanting to live child-free. However, that is not reflective of the people we are speaking to, or to you, Rebecca and Sally Ann, because these are people who have not made the decision to voluntarily live child-free. They have actively tried treatment or tried adoption and tried other things, and it hasn't worked for them. And it's an interesting thing too on language. What's the right name? Should we child-free or childless? Some people think childless is negative. Other people think it's more, and that child-free is a better term. Other people feel like childless is actually a pretty good reflection. Or do you say child-free by choice or child-free not by choice? Whatever you call it, and I think that we have not quite settled on the proper name for that. Whatever we end up calling it, what we're talking about is people who are not voluntarily making this choice. People who the choice is, well, I guess we could say the choice has been made for them, but in fact, that probably isn't the case, because at some point, especially, I think I've always had this image in my head of fertility treatment as an escalator, that you're on an escalator and the next expected treatment is automatically coming at you. You've had a failed IUI. All right, we'll try another IUI, or we'll try this one with injectable meds, or we'll move into IVF. It's always, if one thing fails, the next thing is coming right at you, oftentimes without a decision-making point in there. It's just that as long as your money lasts. And with adoption, although it's a different process, it's also hard to know when to stop. We've waited for 1 year, but it could be next month that, we will be selected by an expectant mom. So, and the other thing is that with both adoption, but especially with infertility treatment, it used to be with infertility that after you reached a certain age, the decision was kind of made for you. But that really isn't the case now. It could be with adoption, but it isn't with infertility. With donor egg, the uterus is functioning so there is no biological endpoint to help you come to the reckoning of when to stop. So, Carol, how do people know when it's time to stop? What are the signs? And how do you know when enough is enough and that it's time to stop?
Well, I like to think of it as resources, that the infertility process, or the process of trying to conceive and the process of trying to become a parent, is one of utilizing resources: financial, emotional, familial, relationship, identity.
Just plain energy.
Yeah. And we know that along the way of both fertility treatment and the process of trying to become parents through adoption, all of those resources are little by little becoming depleted. And so part of the question to ask is there anything left to actually give to a child that we end up having? Do we have financial resources such that our lives will not be so stressful going forward, that we can't provide in a way that we wanted to? Now, most everybody that you and I work with on a regular basis face questions like, well, we're just going to stay in this one-bedroom apartment for a while. We're not going to buy a house because we're putting our financial resources here or there. And that's fine. But at a certain point, for many, the depression sets in. And then there's a question of treating the depression so that their there's enough integrity left in your personhood or your relationship to give to a child. At the end of the day, deciding to live child-free, and just to address that question of language, I do think that the answer is different depending on the circumstance and the people who make that choice. But to your point about age not being a limitation, it's not just because of the uterus, it's because of surrogacy as well. So with surrogacy and egg donation, we do have, unfortunately, 60 and sometimes 70-year-old individuals becoming parents. Mm-hmm. So there is no stopping point there.
Good point.
But the question of whether or not to stop whatever process, one is engaged in, as you guys did, mm-hmm. is really one of evaluating whether or not in the twilight of your lives, the sunset of your lives, you can look back and say, we didn't become moms, we didn't become parents, and we've lived a fulfilling, happy, lives that were meaningful in ways without actually being a parent. Sometimes trying on the future can be a very good exercise in regret avoidance. Mm. When I look at the paths in front of me, which one may I regret the least or not at all? For some people, it just simply is not an option to not be a parent, that is their driving force. And no matter how long it takes and how many disappointments they experience or how many losses they experience, they will keep getting back on that horse until they are ultimately the parents of somebody. But for others, like you guys and many others, apparently 30% of the population, I didn't know that, they can look into their, 80s or 90s and anticipate that their lives will be fulfilled by being active volunteers and mentors and aunts and, involving themselves in rich ways otherwise. And for those people, at a certain point, it makes sense to stop.
Mm-hmm. I think I want to just say I'm the older person in our relationship mm-hmm. by a little over 10 years. Mm-hmm. And 50 was sort of I had this number in mind. And and when we started, we were on the journey for 8 years. I never thought I'd get to 50 and we wouldn't have a child.
Of course, you never do.
You really don't. You think, of course, I'll have a child in 8 years, of course. And then we hit 50, and that's the year that the child loss occurred. And I kind of like, rather than child-free or childless, we have experienced child loss is kind of what I like. But then because of that, we did try for a couple more years. But it did get to I was just like, I don't want to be more than 68 years old and my child's just graduating high school. And I knew I had less energy. And I knew it was just like,
but it was a constant evaluation throughout the whole process, you know, and reevaluating and checking in with each other as well, you know, and
thank goodness for therapy. We were through therapy in the entire process because it helped us to not just think about creating a family, but remember that we are constantly creating our own couplehood, our own relationship.
That you are a family.
Yes. Right. Yeah, you are a family. Exactly. Yes. And we're going to come back to that because I want to talk about the impact of this decision on relationships. Before we get there, though, you raised a point, Rebecca, that I think is a good one. We often hear that there are there are markers that people will set for themselves. They will say, if they're in treatment, they may say, okay, we'll do 3 IUIs, and then maybe I'll try 1 IVF. And that's all I'm going to do. Or I'll try 3 of IVFs. Or I'll try for 2 years. or I'll try until I'm X age. That is a typical thing that we hear. And actually, before people enter treatment, we encourage that. We encourage them to think through what their endpoint might be. Now, the reality is that often changes with both new information and once, unfortunately, I still think sometimes once we're on that escalator, sometimes that changes. But nonetheless, I think that it's still a valuable exercise to go through. Carol, what are some of the other predictable steps or markers that we could use that other people use to help them decide when enough is enough? Or have I mentioned all of them?
No, you definitely haven't, because the other really big one that occurs quite frequently before you get into, like, now we're pursuing adoption, is that when an individual or a couple are pursuing pregnancy and parenthood, because surrogacy is involved, with their own gametes, that is one path. But oftentimes what will happen is that if, for example, donor eggs become necessary, we'll say, or donor sperm, for example, that's a whole new decision tree.
Mm-hmm. We say you're moving off of one escalator onto another one.
Yeah, exactly.
Equal, fine. It's nothing. There's nothing above or below. It's just a different escalator, right?
Right. And so very often, sometimes what I say is, in today's world, because you can take one from column A and one from column B and one from column C, and the uterus is one and the eggs are one, or there's adoption, is we definitely wanted to become parents this way. We wanted to become parents if I could be pregnant and it was my eggs and it was my partner's sperm. But do we still want to be parents if that is not the case? Mm-hmm. And sometimes that's the point at which the decision tree or the escalators diverge. Mm-hmm. And sometimes people decide, we really, really did want to be parents and we wanted to have a child, but we wanted this child. Mm-hmm. We wanted the child that we were imagining that carried our genetics or whatever, or in the case of same-sex couples, at least the genetics of one, right? Mm-hmm. And so in today's world, deciding not to be parents is really a conscious decision not to do something else, because there are so many choices out there.
That's such a good point.
And for that reason, I think child-free is a more accurate description, even though it certainly feels like childlessness, because God knows you guys tried like crazy, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
But you're still deciding either not to continue on a horrible roller coaster, mm-hmm. or two, as I said before, in some cases, deciding not to pursue the alternatives that are available that would make a person a parent, but not a parent the way they originally intended. And that's a decision not to move forward under those circumstances. That's a very conscious decision, even though it might feel like, well, we tried, we just couldn't have a child. That's kind of not the way I view it. It's more, you couldn't have the child that you imagined having or that you wanted to have. And I do think that the consciousness, for you guys, you made a very conscious decision that after child loss and after 2 attempts to become parents that didn't even involve your bodies, that it just gets too painful and too hard, and that you start looking at maybe life could be better if we moved in a different direction and brought positivity into our lives in a different way,
or even
if it means mourning the loss of motherhood.
Yes, mm-hmm. Not necessarily better, but different. It's like
exactly.
Just decided to take a different path to find
sure, exactly.
Right. Yeah,
exactly.
And we really did. I really did feel like we lost the child that we had dreamed of when we lost that infant. Mm-hmm. So there was that whole grief piece there as well. That it was grief on so many parts of the escalator, obviously. But
absolutely.
That definitely informed a lot of the choice.
Yes,
I think
definitely. How much emotional.
I want to say one thing before I come back to that, and the only thing is I want to also, Carol, as to your point, many of the additional steps that you describe, donor egg, surrogacy, and they require a lot of money. So the reality is that it's sometimes people, it's not that they don't choose to do those steps. It's that they simply don't have, they can't do those steps. We hope you will follow or subscribe to the Creating a Family podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. We have been doing this for over 15 years, 15 years in October. And we have a huge library of archive shows, many of which are directly relevant to what you are experiencing now. Once you follow or subscribe, you will have the option and have access to our full library of historic shows. Now, Sally Ann and Rebecca, I want to come back to you and describe the process. Now, I know Rebecca was 50, and that makes Sally Ann somewhere around 40, and you had a child that you thought was going to be your child in your home for 10 days. Then you applied to an adoption agency. So what's the process at that point? How did you make peace with the decision to go forward and say, we are enough. We are a family, and that family is enough. How did you come to that? You've already mentioned therapy. Thank God for therapy. So,
yeah, definitely.
Yeah. That's a good question.
I think that a piece of it for me was just, the devastation. Like, I just wanted to keep trying because of, you don't want to see someone you love in pain. Like, of course, I was in pain as well. And then Sally Ann decided to begin a program, a master's degree in speech language pathology, which she thought about ages ago, but then put off, and her eyes lit up. It's the only way I can say. It's the first time I had seen the light in her eyes since the 2 years prior when we had lost the baby. And there was this hesitation. I remember her be like, should I or shouldn't I do this? And I'm like, go. I don't care how much it costs. I don't care anything, because there is the spark in your eyes again. So that was part of it for me. But how I made peace was seeing this joy created in a different venue.
Yeah, I think it took years. And I think writing the book was part of how I was able to make peace as much as I could. And certainly getting that out there for other people to read it, and sharing this story at various book events and hearing other people's experiences. And I think that is that sort of the generative part of me that wanted to have the baby. At least we were able to pour that into the book itself and know that that's its own creation.
That was a huge part of our healing, because we had the immense ability to run away from home, if you will, and live in a 24-foot RV together for almost a year after we lost the baby. And we got to work remotely, but we spent hours writing, because we both love to write. And then we would read to each other what we had written. So it was this constant check-in. Like, one day I might be so angry about the medical system or something, angry. And on that same day, Sally Ann might be in complete denial and thinking, maybe the mother's going to change her mind and she's going to call us again and we're going to get the baby, but this constant checking in with each other and going through the grief and listening to where you're at today was very healing, and I think helped us process through.
Yeah. And we would read the pieces to each other, and we'd sometimes read them again and again. And I feel like even doing that and doing it right now as we are, traveling around at book events, I feel like we process it again and we come to it from a different vantage point. But making peace takes a great deal of effort, just like everything else has.
Yeah.
So, grief takes effort.
Yes, it does.
And grieving takes time and it takes effort. It's a very active process.
Yes.
Yeah. And we'll come to that, because I do want to think through some of the ways to, I always use the word resolve with air quotes around it, because I don't really know that grief is resolved, but making peace is probably a better way of saying, with the grief and with the decision. But before we get there, I want to go back to Carol. We've heard how Sally Ann and Rebecca came to the decision. How do you see other people? You've mentioned trying on the future.
Yeah.
And we've mentioned
that's a big one.
Yeah. Okay. What are some other ways that people can they don't know if they've reached the point where they should stop. And are they giving up their dream? Is this foolish? That type of thing.
Well, yeah, they are giving up their dream. And the question is, can they? And again, some people can, and then change the dream. So, sometimes in fertility counseling, when we're helping people make decisions to have children in a different way than they thought they would, I use the expression, if you can't have what you originally wanted, maybe you can want what you can have.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so maybe we can want a life that looks different than we originally intended. You and I have talked before, Dawn, about an active grieving process of saying goodbye to the child that we tried to have. And that might be the genetic child. It might be the child that we carry in our bodies. And it might be the child that we end up not parenting at all.
Yes.
And I think this is applicable here as well, that for you guys, writing the book was very much similar to something we've talked about here before, which is writing a letter to the child we'll never know. And while that is an exercise that I recommend to every single person who's going to become a parent in a different way than they intended, primarily, genetically speaking, is writing a letter to the child we'll never know. I think it's quite applicable here as well. It's incredibly hard. It is so sad. Everyone cries when I kind of describe this exercise to do. But, when we experience a death in the family, we have ritual around it.
Yes.
We have, cultural norms that allow us to say goodbye to people who have left us. But when you become a parent to a child you didn't originally think you'd be parenting, or you don't become a parent at all, you are indeed saying goodbye to the child you'll never know. And that is saying goodbye to somebody you never got to say hello to. So I think this exercise of literally writing a letter, to the child you imagined, and for you guys, it is a child through adoption as well, the child that you lost, and then having a ritual that, frankly, I know it's hard to talk about, and people are like, oh my God, that's so morbid, but it's really giving yourselves the funeral that you don't get because it's somebody that wasn't here.
Yes.
And in your case, they were here. They just weren't able to stay with you.
Well, some of the times the failed IUIs would have indicated that for that child was not there. For the child through adoption, that child was there. So it was both.
Exactly.
You're right. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, describe what you mean by giving yourself a funeral.
So the exercise that I've talked about here in terms of moving into non-genetic parenting, for example, but it applies for making a choice not to parent, is writing a letter to the child you'll never know, and then doing something with it that is akin to a funeral and gives you that ritual. So, for example, we have funerals are for the living, right? We go to a cemetery and we see somebody being lowered into the ground and we say goodbye and we cry, and there's a church service, or depending on your religion, people get together, they eat food, they tell funny stories about the person who's gone. And there really is a recognition when that happens, or you scatter ashes. They're very concrete kind of reminders, like they're really gone. I can't call grandma tomorrow to see how she's feeling. But we don't get that when we're trying to say goodbye to somebody who's amorphous, somebody who we never really got to meet. And so giving yourselves a funeral, one of the examples that a lot of my clients do is they plant a tree or a bush in their garden, and they bury the letters that they've written along with the tree or the bush. And you're watching this beautiful thing flourish, but the act of digging this hole and planting a plant and putting the letter in with it is very graveside-y. It's very, funereal and very physical. And it feels like you have really like buried this child that you didn't get to meet, or in your case, ladies, the child you did get to meet and lost. Another example, I'm in California, in Southern California, so a lot of my clients will go to the ocean. And the ocean is very ephemeral. It's very eternal. The tides come in, they go out. And so they will read the letter to each other and then rip it up and throw it in the water and watch the tide kind of bring it in and out and in and out. And it's very healing.
Can I just piggyback on that just for a moment? I really, really appreciated that you acknowledged that, Carol, and these different ways to, provide the ritual for the grief. I know certainly part of when we ran away from home, when we lost the baby that we had as well, we didn't have that ritual in place. And most of the people in our life, these people that had been welcoming him into our world, also didn't know what to do and how to support us. And I think that they felt very much either lost or just weren't able to acknowledge it. Some people were like, well, that's okay. You'll have another chance or another.
At least you got to have him for 10 days. At least, like people say stupid things. When they don't know what to say, they say stupid things, and not to be
They
mean.
do.
They just do. And and so I think all of us were at a loss. So I loved that you mentioned even having family and friends come. And I have sort of a funny little story. So I had a miscarriage in a previous relationship, and I planted a tree that died a few months later. But what's fascinating is going out there, ripping up that tree and smashing it was probably more therapeutic than like anything.
Planting the tree.
Even planting the damn tree.
So it felt
so good.
They're concrete. It's something concrete that we can do that really acknowledges a loss that is otherwise invisible. And it's very hard to grieve losses that are invisible, not only to us sometimes, but to others. So these exercises really give us a very concrete way of saying, especially when people write letters to the child that they're not going to know or not going to have, is often when people realize that they've been carrying around a very specific child in their heart for years and years and years. And for most people, it's a chip off the old block. It's somebody who looks just like grandma or has their particular nose or has a particular talent that runs in the family. And oftentimes is even a specific gender. And sometimes it's not until you write this letter that all those things come to the fore and you realize it really is a very specific child that you've been grieving. It's not just the idea of parenting.
And different griefs happened through, like, I had an emergency hysterectomy right around the time that we were deciding to expand our family. So there was that feeling, I can't even do anything about it. I can't help it. I'm sure that, maybe even in a same-sex couple, like with whoever the problem is lying within, or the obstacle, the other person in the couple can be like just that feeling, that grief of helplessness. Like, I can't make this happen.
In your case, Rebecca and Sally Ann, it sounds like you came to this decision not at exactly the same time, but you were moving in together towards this decision, and we're checking in. But I'm curious, and Carol, I'll throw this to you. What to do when people are not on the same page? When one person says, and this is assuming that the people are coupled. One person says, you know what? You talked about resources. My resources are out. I don't want to keep spending money on this. I don't want to keep spending energy on this. I'm tired of seeing you cry all the time. I'm tired of our life being nothing other than about this quest. But the other person says, my life will not be complete without this. What then?
It's probably the hardest. It is probably the question that does not have a decent answer. But I will say that it's not that different from other conflicts that couples encounter where one person has a very strong opinion in one direction and the other person has a strong opinion in the other direction is how do you resolve those differences? Talk, counseling. But I will say at the end of the day, the person, if there is a person who doesn't want to parent, maybe parent that way, as I said before, and this is not a popular opinion, that person trumps, because it's never fair to bring a child into a relationship where one person is ambivalent. I mean, ambivalence is normal, right? I mean, everybody has some apprehension, right? But it's not fair to bring a child into a relationship where one person said, I really don't want to do this, but acquiesces somehow to please their partner.
You know, Carol, I would say that that's not that person trumps, but it's the best interest of the child that would be brought in
way of saying it.
That trumps. Because ultimately, to bring a child into this world where one of the parents is not wanting it is
right.
It's just
and that often means, again, bringing a child into that relationship that way. And we see this, I know you do, and I see this so often, particularly around adoption, where there's been a fertility journey, it has not worked out, and adoption may be the last best option. I mean, I don't think of adoption that way. I know you don't either, but sometimes it is for people.
And there's nothing wrong with saying, I don't want to parent a child who is not genetically related. I think we could get on our
that's the biggest gift we can give, right?
Sure, exactly. If that's not for you, then for goodness sakes,
don't do it.
Don't do it.
But as you said, couples don't always agree on that. And one person might feel very comfortable pursuing adoption. So it's just very challenging, and there's no good option. What I see, honestly, most often is that one person acquiesces. And I like to think most cases, they fall in love, they end up being great parents, they go forward, et cetera, and it works out fine. But honestly, in some of those cases, the relationship doesn't make it.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great segue, because I wanted to talk with Rebecca and Sally Ann about how, in your case, it sounds like, and from reading the book, it is that you were more or less on the same page at more or less the same time. But how has the decision to live child-free, how has that impacted your relationship?
It's a big question, big answer.
I think there are still moments I'm lonely for another child.
Yeah.
There's just this loneliness, is this kid-shaped hole. I know after my miscarriage, I literally remember it feeling like my arms were literally in pain for the baby that I wanted to hold and wasn't there. And sometimes I'll randomly, I remember being in a store and we did like a lamb theme in the nursery, and seeing this blanket with a lammy kind of thing and just bursting into tears. And it was after it was, quote, resolved. It wasn't like,
that's why I don't like the word resolve.
No, because but like, I was extremely close to my grandmother, who died almost 30 years ago, and I'm still alive and I'm okay. And it doesn't mean that once in a while at Christmas, I don't cry because I miss her. I'll always miss Grandma Sinclair. But it doesn't mean that there isn't joy in our lives. And I think the most amazing thing for me is to have a partner who, when I start crying in the store, can put her arm around me and say, hey, tell me what's going on. And I can say, the lammy blanket, and she just throws her arms around me and hugs me and is fine with me sobbing in the store and can feel the pain with me. And then we can go have hot chocolate with little marshmallows in it or something. And, you can, I guess, having a partner who is there with you.
Yeah, I think that, first and foremost, we have made a commitment to each other And I feel like even throughout the struggles and, and the losses that we experienced, that we kept doing what we could to show up for each other.
Yes.
And it wasn't always easy. And I definitely think counseling made a big difference as well. So
having someone remind you to, even though here we're reading to each other, things we're thinking and feeling, or, it can sound like we were totally on the same page, but there's always going to be moments in the relationship when you need that person like Carol to say, I'm not sure you actually heard what she just said from your response. Let's, think about this differently, or all the zillion wonderful things that counselors bring to the table and help you see the other person's perspective.
But the other thing that changed in your relationship was that you shifted directions and you birthed a different kind of child in the form of the book.
Yes.
You created a new goal.
Yes.
Like, we have to have goals, right?
Yes.
In order to keep us moving forward, no matter what it is, even if it's day by day or hour by hour. And you very much changed your goals. You created a new career. You wrote this book together.
Yes.
And so it seems like you envisioned a different life going forward.
Yes.
As opposed to this vast emptiness.
Yes.
And you have to, right? Because otherwise we would just sink into huge depression.
Totally.
And we're both such people, be social workers, education, things we've done. And the idea that we created something, we looked for books that didn't have the perfect happy ending, because we're also avid readers. And
that's such a good point.
There weren't any books that we could relate to. It made us feel even more alone. And so what we've finding in our book readings and connecting with people is that exactly what we wanted is that other people pick it up, read it, and go, oh, I'm not the only one that is going through all of this and ending up at the end of the road without a baby in my arms. And it's just, that's like another goal, another way of connecting and making it feel worthwhile.
And making a difference.
Yes.
Yes, making a positive difference. And the book, and by the way, the book, I'll give the name again, Uncertain Fruit, by Rebecca and Sally Ann Majoya. You are correct that the vast majority of books, I only know one other one that does talk about this, but I from a memoir standpoint. But I also think that organizations like ours, we talk about how you get there, but the decision, but what if getting there isn't where you thought you were going to get? You're not going to get the happy ending that you expect. And that does happen. And I think we have left people high and dry in that respect. So I'm so appreciative that you took your pain and directed it to something that could help others. This show is sponsored by Cryos International Sperm and Egg Bank. Cryos International is dedicated to providing a wide selection of high-quality, extensively screened, frozen donor sperm and eggs. They use from all races, ethnicities, and phenotypes. And from their sperm, this is both for home insemination as well as fertility treatment. Cryos International is the world's largest sperm bank and the first freestanding independent egg bank in the United States. I have an unusual question, or it's not actually unusual, it's actually a very common question. It doesn't apply to same-sex couples, but it does apply to other heterosexual couples, and that is, once you've made this decision, you've come to peace as a couple or as individuals, you've made the decision, do you start using birth control? Do you stay in that place of not trying? Well, we're really not trying, but we're not trying to prevent. Or do you take active steps to keep yourself from getting pregnant? Carol, thoughts?
Well, if for people with a strong spiritual or religious bent, many of them will say, well, let God decide. I think they're lucky if that's what they believe, because it's something to pin on. And therefore, they would not necessarily prevent pregnancy. They would just let some higher power decide that. I don't know that there is a drawback to not using birth control, even though I'm a huge proponent of a very conscious decision not to parent, as we talked about earlier, to be child free. But I don't know if it's a contradiction to say we are child free. We have decided not to pursue alternative paths to parenting. And also say, you never know. I don't know that there's a drawback to doing that, but for some, they really needed to be a much more definitive so that they're not again on that roller coaster, because we know that for some of those people, they may get pregnant and have more losses. And that is devastating. And for those people, I think they do use birth control because they've really made a decision not to stay on that craziness.
I don't know, Carol, if you would agree with this, but it seems like that it needs to be an individual decision. And if you are continuing on the emotional roller coaster, even if you're not getting pregnant, but you have your period every month and you're crying because and even if you're saying, oh, we're really not trying, but if you're counting days and you go, I'm maybe a day late, oh my God, am I pregnant? Am I pregnant? And that if you can't get off that roller coaster, then that may be the reason that you decide.
If
because
you're counting days, you're not child free, right?
No, you really haven't.
You're still childless.
Yes. And so I think it almost has to be an individual decision. And you're right. People who have experienced repeated losses, that's a different situation entirely. They're getting pregnant. They can't keep the pregnancy and they may not want to keep getting pregnant and not keeping it. So I think I think it feels to me like it almost has to be an individual decision. And that decision can change too. I certainly know of couples who were not trying, we're not preventing, but we're not really trying type of thing because they had been unsuccessful. And then started getting very comfortable and beginning to see a new life. And it was almost a good transition period for them. And then one case, this was a heterosexual couple, and the guy went out, had a vasectomy. And it was because there was a joint decision. And it was because they were at this point saying, you know what? We like the new life we've done. We are doing things that are exciting and fun, and we see the future, and we want this future. And so we don't. If we were to get pregnant now, I don't know how we'd feel. So anyway, I throw that out there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked about the ambiguous grief or the unrecognized grief, and that is another really hard part of this. Another hard part, I think, is society not quite knowing what to do with people who have made this decision. And I'm curious, Sally Ann, have y'all, I'll turn it to both of you, you could decide. Sally Ann and Rebecca, have y'all experienced that where people don't quite accept your decision? After a certain age, I will point out that stops, but have y'all experienced that?
It's interesting because I don't really feel like we did get a lot of pushback, but also we were older.
Yeah, I think I got more pushback
you got more pushback when I was continuing.
Yes.
Then you got a lot of people going, "Well, you're getting so old. Are you like, come on, you really don't. Why don't you admit to her you don't want to do this?"
Right.
That's really helpful. Yeah, that's really helpful.
Yeah.
Or are you sure about that one? Are you sure?
Yeah.
Are you sure?
And I think after anyone who knew us very well at all knew the loss that we had gone through. Mm-hmm. And I think we're very understanding that we didn't want to have that happen again. Just the level of pain.
But I do, and I have, we both have several friends who have chosen to be child free. And I know that they have repeatedly gotten a lot of pushback from family members, especially that, oh, come on, you've changed your mind now. You're really going to have a child. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a very real situation for a lot of individuals.
Yeah, definitely. Mm-hmm. Definitely.
It's insulting to suggest that a decision that you've made so consciously and with so much thought that, you just don't really know. You don't really understand what you've done. It's really offensive. Mm-hmm. And of course, this time of year is horrendous because there's so much socialization And anybody who has made this decision, let alone anybody going through fertility treatment, as you know, Dawn, dreads the, do you have any kids? So do you have any kids? So do you have children?
Any holidays with this would hit, but you're right.
Totally. Whether you're still trying or you have decided not to pursue parenthood, it's just a dreaded question because there's a dull thud in the room after the answer is no, actually, I don't. So everyone really needs to find their responses in a way that, maybe to make themselves feel more comfortable, maybe to make the asking person feel more comfortable, to include then, maybe you talk about your pets, but that's so cliche, but maybe you talk about your life. Maybe you talk about your career, because for so many, understandably, your career is your baby, right? But that it's so hard. It's just...
Well, in your case, y'all could say, well, no, but we have a book that will explain.
Right?
There you go.
Yeah, we have friends who are of the age where we have friends who are who will whine about their kids not giving them grandchildren. Yes. And I am quite quick to say that's not what that's about. They need to decide when that's right for them and if that's right for them, and kind of reining them in. But we've given birth to a book.
Well, thank you so much, Carol Lieber-Wilkins and Rebecca and Sally Ann Majoya. Their book is Uncertain Fruit. We are so thankful to have the three of you talk about this topic. It is one we need to talk more about. So I am very appreciative that you are here to talk about it. And I would say that it's not just other people, but it's the infertility professionals, infertility nurses, and infertility doctors. I think they are equally as uncomfortable with this conversation, and perhaps even more so. And so I think that this is a service to educate all of us, professionals as well as patients and lay people, that this is a decision that is the ending for many people, and we need to support them in this.